The Porcine Horror, Pig-ocalypse. Part 2. Return to Black Cat Ridge. Let's get straight into that. Just down this way, best fishing I ever seen, ever since the big storm. Don't know why, but everything in this part of the river is bigger and meaner than it was, Johnny Ho said, over his shoulder to his cousin Dong and their friend Ray. Kinda weird stuff for a while. Mostly gone now, but the fish are still big and will bite at any bait. He led them through the overgrowth along the San Jacinto River, just west of the bend for Black Cat Ridge, and headed towards Crazy Coon Hill. It was rough country, but he'd travelled it frequently in the past 2 years. He paused when he noted a face grinning at him at eye level, a malevolent face with dark markings around the eyes like a mask. He quickly realised that it was one of the freaky raccoons perched in a tree. It chittered at him, laughed in an all-too-human manner, and then disappeared among the dense foliage. They were definitely near the best fishing spot for giant catfish. The freaks, they fished there as well. Dong had not seen their visitor, but Ray had. He and Johnny had lived in the area their entire lives and had encountered the freaky rockets only for the past couple of years. Locals called them that after the Marvel character, though these things were different. They had faces. He gave Johnny a look, but they kept trekking forward. They came out of the jungle, a little west of the normal fishing hole, near the top of a small rise that dropped precipitously to the river. An old tree stood at the apex of the rise. A battered and broken limb hung out over the flowing water, and with the remnants of the rope swing from happier days, dangling and swaying with a slight breeze. Ray turned when a rumbling, deep grunt sounded from behind him. Dong stopped and turned, and Johnny was in the middle of turning when the monstrosity slammed into Ray and gored him in its midsection with its saber-sharp tusk. When the head rose and tossed him aloft, the oversized tooth remained in his abdomen during the first phase of his flight and ripped through so that his entrails spilled over the large and hideous face of his killer. Dong stepped forward and bravely used his fishing pole and tackle box to alternatively strike the beast. He managed one strike with each instrument before the porcine horror surged forward and knocked him onto his back. He shouted defiance and fear as the enormous jaws closed around his face. Johnny exercised the better part of valor. He dropped his fishing gear and ran directly towards the old tree. He leapt out and caught the rotten old rope from the swing, as close to the branch as he could manage. The rope creaked alarmingly, and he managed to scramble up enough to grasp the limb with his other hand. He glanced back in time to see his cousin die bravely. He considered dropping into the river for swimming across, or at least away from the monster hog, but he looked before he leapt. A good idea, since the state had dredged the river after the storm. He urinated and added the drops to the mighty flow. At the bottom of the dirt bluff created by the abrupt edge of the earth meeting water, a small patch of white sand, was a writhing mass. Cottonmouths, his mind gibbered. His breathing was too laboured to scream as he normally would. The horror below was a nest of venomous, waterborne vipers in a mating ball. He looked desperately back at the oversized, hairy hog and then down at the fresh horror below. His heart had to work harder to pump blood up to his desperately gripping hands. He looked up at those loyal but weakening appendages, and then, as he chanced another look downward, the tree shook. Slightly, but even that was alarming. It bent outward over the current for just a moment, just out over the last of the reptiles and over the shallows. The tree snapped back as the saber-toothed hog released the pressure it had applied. It swayed frighteningly, and Johnny pulled and tugged to try and gain a better purchase. He managed to hook a leg over the limb as it at last gave way to old age, battering, and now the latest abuse of 140 pounds human dangling from it. Johnny saw the sky above lurch and felt the weight of his body disappear. His feet rose and he plummeted into the nightmare at the base of the bluff. And as the impact, followed by the massive amount of venom, took hold and caused his consciousness to fade, he could have sworn that he'd heard a grunting, wet chuckle from up on top of the bluff. 1 month earlier. Looked out across the river from a small rise in the land as the two legs wrapped up work for the day. He had always been interested in their activities, especially since his mother had forbidden him and his little mates from going anywhere near the creatures. The forbidden was fascinating to any young being and with a mind for curiosity. Even the lower orders of animals could experience such interest. He saw that these creatures, that smelled quite edible, had been removing material from the river bottom for at least his entire lifespan. The channel was deeper, though there was still a large bar of sand on the opposite bank, the side of the river where his father and old sounder had perished. Only his mother had escaped, and now he and his siblings would from the core of a new sounder. His mother had set the boundaries of their new territory that resided between the river and a large creek that flowed in from the northwest. The area was full of brush and swamps and thick growths of trees, a veritable jungle paradise, full of food and cooling wallows. They had yet to find a sounder with beings like themselves, just ordinary feral hogs that lacked the long coats of coarse hair and the large nodule on their foreheads. And of course, the tusks that rose disproportionately higher than those of their lesser relatives. Their sows were much too small for him to mate, though just right for a meal. He had started to feel the urges of adolescence, and it had become a little maddening. It was why his mother allowed him to range away from his 3 sisters. For the moment, his greatest urge was hunger. He wanted something large to kill and eat. Perhaps one day he would range across the river to search for others of his kind. Russell made his way through the thick brush on the south side of the river. He had made a driving trail for his 4-wheeler and trailer rig, but the last little bit of the journey to his warehouse had to be on foot, and he was careful to avoid making an obvious trail. It was incredibly convenient to have this underdeveloped band of wilderness so close to hand from his apartment. It was simply too swampy and prone to flooding to interest anyone in building, yet he'd found a rise, no more than a hummock, but a higher elevation than most of the area, and had decided to build and maintain his storage facility out away from prying eyes. Everything had become more dangerous with the advent of the satellites and drones, but he'd been operating the facility for over 2 decades and made a fair living storing the illicit property of his criminal allies. It was close enough to be convenient, yet most of them would not be able to trek into the terrain. He had been shocked last year when he realized that he had made it to the age of 42 without dying of disease or mishap or murder. And as he approached a single-room building, he saw the outline of it in the shadow of several large trees. Moss covered the roof, something he'd not only allowed but cultivated. He used barrels and other containers to break up the lines of rectangular structure. One would have to know where it was to find it. Wait, that part? It looks funny, like someone parked a big car out beside my shack, he thought as he approached the building. His analysis was interrupted when he saw the glowing pair of eyes, large, red and set near the same height as his own, baleful eyes that narrowed when they met his own, as though their owner felt challenged. Russ turned to run, to flee back to his little buggy, forget loading anything. He just wanted to go home and hide under his bed. Yet no sooner had he turned and taken his first few steps than he heard a scuffling sound, followed quickly by a rumble that swiftly increased in pace, tempo, and volume. And he couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder. The move cost him a step or two and shifted his direction a little to one side. He saw a large, hair-covered mass mottled in dark colours and caught the briefest glimpse of a gleaming saber-length tusk just as it entered his lower back. He felt himself tossed upward and the air spilled from his lungs. The agony of his tearing organs was incredible and caused his mind to scream since his body was incapable. And suddenly, the pressure was off, and while the pain continued, the ripping sensation did not. He lay on his side and heard the slow, stumping footsteps approach his backside. And there was a brief pressure and pain on his head, and then Nothing.
You will bring the two-legged hunters. We will be destroyed.
Mother had raged.
All for hunger. Have you lost your lump?
Mother had unreasonably grown angry in reaction after his mistake in killing the lone two legs. The one who had invaded their territory regularly with arrogant impunity. Now, the entire Sounder stood at the edge of the San Jacinto River and prepared to cross over to what the humans called Black Cat Ridge. It was a place of foul memories for his mother, but also one that was familiar, and would hold them until the two legs had completed their search, if they did one. The Sounder could simply not take the chance. Present day. Bjorn, looking more like a grown bear these days. Can I call you cub anymore? Blue Jay greeted his friend and erstwhile teammate. The large young man favoured him with a grin that was surprisingly warm and not. Blue Jay, good to see you are on your feet. One old and one new, is it? And Blue Jay nodded. Yes, my entire left side is now a biomechanical miracle. Bjorn shook his head. At least you have a cool nom de guerre. Now, we have 14 seconds before we are due for our meeting. They counted down from 10, and at 5, Bjorn knocked on the door. It opened as the seconds counted down and the alarm on his device sounded. A large face that rested even above that of Bjorn's grinned at them, and heavy brows waggled. I appreciate your punctuality. You were obviously trained by superior employees. After greetings and some catching up on where each party had been and what adventures they'd encountered, Brain began the briefing. We are conducting a follow-up on Black Cat Ridge. Blue Jay, you got your intro to DMTS Inc. after the last attack of the killer hogs. Bjorn, you were there in your extended basic training phase. And the kids you've been training, the Cryptid cat crew, were all mulling pups in school while their daddies were gobbled up by saber-toothed mammoth hogs. At the time, no one linked the local disappearances to the snacking of the big pigs. Had it not been for the braggadocio sheriff facing re-election, the general public would never have suspected the mutated creatures. It would have just become another legend. Still, we were able to pass it off as a single aberration, a one-time genetic monster. The flood from the hurricane allowed for many creatures to be mutated, and we believed that we had the situation in hand. You are aware, of course, that it was one of our experimental labs that was flooded. The contents, mixed with the illicit substances from our local manufacturers, created a Frankenstein's brew for the local fauna. Some were our own escapees and some were natural mutations. You can see why it's a critical concern that requires discretion. And we've been monitoring the area since then, and the disappearances have begun again, several at this point. We have to stop it before it again gets out of hand. In addition to Bjorn's 3 brats, we are sending 2 more field associates. Blue Jay, congratulations. You are our team leader on this one. Your first lead. The 2 associates include McCall and his pups in case you need to do any tracking. They are the only hounds raised to hunt cryptids. The other is your friend and mentor, Silvio. He frowned slightly. Wish I was going. However, I'm stuck here as your go-to manager. Now, let's get into what we know so far. Freddy was tired, yet he was ready to begin the day's work, shifting river muck. The dredging work seemed to be taking forever, and the costs had skyrocketed. The latter was not his worry, but if the project was cancelled, he'd have to move on to another gig. He liked this one. It was close to home. He decided to drain the main vein in the bush next to the makeshift employee parking lot, since he hadn't had a chance to take care of it before he left home, and now it was getting urgent. He sighed in relief as the pressure released and things flowed well. It was a nice morning, a little fog out over the river, cool enough for the long sleeves but not freezing. And the first rosy rays of dawn permeating the eastern horizon. And then he heard something move inside the brush. Likely just some local wildlife, but there were some weird people who lived around Black Cat Ridge, and one had to be careful. As he zipped up his trousers and turned back towards the parking lot, there was a rush of sound from the rear part of his left flank. He felt a heavy, painful crunch in his buttocks and then found himself rising into the air. As he descended, too surprised to even catch himself, he felt an enormous pressure and a ripping of flesh as a large, sharp object entered his left kidney, so recently emptied. He drew in a breath to scream at the agonizing wound, but found himself once more airborne, now with the breath forced from his lungs and the world was spinning. He caught sight of a monstrous, dark head and the gleam of glowing red eyes as he struck the ground. This morning ain't so great after all, he thought as his killer began to consume him. TJ assumed the grimmest of his typically grim expressions. I don't care about school. We picked up some serious training with Uncle Jim. Now it's time to use it to slaughter the monsters that killed our dads. Will, his best friend, and his younger sister Cassie stood beside him, all arranged beside the cattle pond on the Broxton property. And Cassie nodded. Yeah, I want to kill some freaky pigs. Besides, I have geometry this year. Can't stomach that. And Will, whose face would normally sport a crooked grin, frowned. Well, that's great for you two. Seems your uncle and cousin have opened a door for you that you want to enter. I know I'm invited, but I'm not sure it's a great idea. I need to help Mum and the little ones. TJ nodded. You'll do that best by getting a high-paying job ASAP. Cousin Ed said that the DMT Solutions would take care of high school diplomas and transcripts, and that if we do a good enough job, they'll come up with the same for college, at least undergrad. Look, I know you do more than contribute funds to your family's well-being. You are the lead for your brother and sister, but you have to decide. You can't do DMTS fieldwork half-heartedly. If you get distracted, you or others will suffer. And Will nodded. I know. I'm definitely in for this one. Gotta get revenge for Dad. He held up a hand. I know, with animals it's not personal, but somehow with these, I think it is. So, you've met McCall? Jay asked his supersized friend, and Bjorn nodded. When I was training, first day during the tour. He and his team are incredible. Make sure you let them get a good whiff. You don't want those two taking a dislike to you. No, here comes Silvio the Fox. Both young men looked towards their friend and mentor as he entered the primary entrance to Interactive Training Studio A. And the lean, vulpine man grinned. Ha, my former trainees, all grown up and out in the world creating mayhem. I'm so proud. I hear that we are to have fresh meat to train. The young people we met last year on Cat Hunt, yes, Blue Jay? Blue Jay grinned. The same. We meet and brief them on sight. We don't want their mothers to be worried about them. As you know, they have a personal stake in all of this. And Silvio's features tightened for a moment. Ah, yes. Sound business about the fathers. So, Bjorn, you are keeping things cool? No magnificent rages? Bjorn nodded. Silvio laughed. Still grim and closed-mouthed when that subject is broached. We will have to work on making it fun for you. He looked at Blue Jay. You are recuperating when we wrapped up Aslan? You wouldn't believe what our friend did. Him and Pearly Gates both. A shame about her. He looked down and shook his head. Two sets of loud single barks resounded from the other side of one of the secondary doors. They were followed by a sharp command. A field associate entered the room from that direction and approached the group. McCall. The man introduced himself. He looked at each of his new teammates in turn. Blue Jay, team leader on this one. We haven't met. Silvio, old fox. We've had some high times together, especially once you learn to play in the wilds and just not the urban jungle. Bjorn, no longer a cub. I heard about the op at the pyramid. Nasty stuff. Hopefully you won't encounter those big fellows again until you have more experience. Now, you ready to meet my partners? He gave an odd whistle, and the door handle flipped downward, and two great beasts burst through, all muscles, snarls, teeth, and hair, bounding towards the quartet of mere mortals. Sheriff Bates looked over his tactical team leaders with his steely gaze. Looks like we're missing some more folks up by Black Cat Ridge. Time was, that will be standard, and we might not even know. And then the big PIG shook up the whole area. Now, every time anything goes wrong, people think it's monsters. Investigators from across the river recovered the body of one of the missing. Bad scene. Motive was snake bites. Nothing unusual, other than the man was a local. I should have known how to avoid mating bundles. As for his two friends, well, there've been no signs. Another missing, a construction worker, one of the crane operators. Workers walk off the job occasionally, but this guy, he was stable. Home life, all they found was his car. Fortunately, it rained the day he was reported missing, so there's no other signs. It's hard to get volunteers after what happened to the last ones who searched up that way. Well, this time, I'm inclined to agree. We think we've kept things quiet, so there shouldn't be any entrepreneurs out trying to collect a non-existent reward. Enough of you have experience in the woods that you should be fine. Keep the teams together. No fewer than 8 on each one, with at least 2 heavy rifles per team. He continued the briefing and prepared to turn loose his experts. Munched the last of the little hooved beast he'd encountered. It had been with a small herd that escaped a nearby enclosure. It had brayed pitifully when he caught up to it, yet the thing had landed a couple of painful kicks to his left side before he ended the struggle. He'd have to remember that the next time he encountered one.
Tasty, but the hooves, they were sharp.
He had enjoyed this side of the river. He still couldn't understand what his mother had feared. The two legs were like any other animal, oblivious to threats until it was too late. Will, his ebullient nature once more in evidence, looked around the circle of DMT Solutions Incorporated personnel. So, we hit the ground running and found nothing in the dark, even with our fancy goggles. What next? And Bjorn rumbled. Well, I'm convinced you are blood kin to Jungle Jim Bruxton. And Cassie, never one to be left out of the conversation, added, Yes, he's like Uncle Jim, and so are we all. He was a great mentor, though he took all the fun out of these high-tech gadgets. And she looked down at a multi-brand night vision sets that were rested in her lap, and Blue Jay nodded wearily. Yes, first night was a bust, and so we're going to call in some higher tech. He rolled his eyes upward and raised his chin. We'll be given satellite priority for the next 48 hours, provided nothing big happens elsewhere. So, not much rest for the wicked. We meet up in 6 hours. He had been fairly quiet during the first sojourn to the swamps around the lower areas of the ridge. He had worked as a campus police officer at a nearby college when the first set of Porcine horrors had attacked and all but killed him. Bjorn and Silvio had caught him glancing at his cobalt blue left arm several times, the one to replace what the feral hogs had taken and eaten. Later, when the apprentices had gone inside one of the RVs to sleep, the old men sat in the circle. Bran and Skylon flopped on either side of McCall and occasionally looked up hopefully to see if anyone had food they could mooch or would offer a scratch. Skylon inched closer to Bjorn and was rewarded with a belly rub. The young berserker related as much as he could recall about what had happened in the bowels of the pyramid of Aslan. Silvio enthusiastically filled in the details, his eyes grown distant with memories. Magnifico, I tell you. He actually climbed the giant using knives like a mountaineer with pythons. If we hadn't stopped him, he'd have killed the thing. First time I heard of anyone taking on one of those things like that, mano a mano. He shook his head and remembered in wonderment. Jay looked on thoughtfully. He had heard the tower in full when he was debriefed after the mission and surgery to replace his left leg that was shattered by a bullet. Yet McCall had heard only rumours. Wish I could have been there on that one, but we have other duties assigned to us. The lads are great, but a little conspicuous in crowded cities and barrens. So, there really is something more to you? A gift? A young feminine voice inquired, and Cassie and the others had quietly rejoined the group of hunters. Bjorn shrugged. I didn't always see it as a gift, more like a curse. It caused me many issues as a teen. DMT scrubbed the internet stories, but I was infamous for a short time. Brain and some others trained me, though. I can't truly control the beast within. The episodes take me, but I have more control over when they do. When I'm trained hard enough to channel, or maybe focus is a better word, the rage and still use some of my skills. And he harumphed. Ha! That's the most I've said about it to anyone in a while. Since I can usually head off the anger before it triggers an episode, I don't consciously consider it as often as back when it would hit unexpectedly, on slight provocation or none at all. He looked around and saw the naked curiosity in the faces of his comrades, not just the teens. He took a deep breath. Okay. Not the whole story, but in a nutshell. I had some episodes in early adolescence that led me to be homeschooled. Did fine in that environment. When I turned 16, a few of us with shiny new driver's licenses took the entire class to lunch at a nearby sandwich shop. My buddy Clifton and I were the last two of the group in line since we were eldest and assigned to keep an eye on the younger kids and to pay for their meals. Through the doorway came a couple of guys who wore hoodies, sunglasses, and medical masks. Face diapers, Uncle Jim would have called them. The first pulled a pistol from his pocket of his hoodie, raised it towards the cashier. The other, who already had his pistol in hand, fired a round at the ceiling. I was startled and my ears began ringing and roaring, and then the red mist began to creep into my vision as my heart rate rose precipitously. The one who had fired the shot screamed at the crowd. You motherfuckers get down on the ground. Every goddamn one of you, get down now. Most of the patrons complied pretty quickly, but some of my classmates, they did not. They were scared, confused children. He raised the pistol and struck one of the younger girls in that group. Sherry fell to the floor. Blood seeped from her cut on her cheek and tears welled from her eyes. She was brave, though, and stayed quiet. The red mist closed in and the roaring sound beat out the tinnitus just as the robber at the cash register pushed Clifton into me. Get the fuck out of my way, stupid fuckers. Why aren't you on the ground, polar bear? I don't remember doing it, but I had a chance to watch the store surveillance video later. I used my right elbow to strike him in the jaw. He started to roll backwards and dropped the pistol. I stepped forward and drove my knee into his gut. Then I used my left hand to seize his face and drive his head into the glass cover over the counter. It had broken. I may have gone on pounding him, but the other one shot me. Apparently, he fired a few rounds and missed, but number 4 or 5 caught me on the right side, just under my right arm. Just a flesh wound, but it scraped along my ribs and caught my attention, such as it was in that mindless state. He found shortly that he did not want my attention. He had walked a little closer as he sprayed and prayed. As you can see, I have really long arms. I turned around into my wounded side to face him, and as I did, I swiped at his face and backhanded his cheek. It resulted in a wound similar to what he'd given little Sherry, and with my other hand, I grabbed the muzzle of his pistol and shoved it towards his face. Bjorn paused and drew in a quiet breath. The projectile struck at the base of his eyelid, then tore off the front part of his skull. I was drenched in blood. He fell faster than I'd ever seen anyone fall, like he'd lunged at the floor. Yet my rage wasn't spent. Poor Clifton had recovered and stepped towards me, grabbing at my arm. I laid him out with a left hook. Everyone else cowered in fear. I had become secondary threat after the robbers. I stood there, breathing heavily for a while. And then I collapsed into a chair at the closest table. That's when the cops arrived. The media, press, and social, we had a field day. Our homeschool group was labelled some type of racist cult, despite our diversity, and I was called a neo-Nazi white supremacist, and all sorts of equally absurd appellations with no basis, in fact. It was all very catchy, a 9-day wonder, except it went on for much longer than 9 days. Fortunately, a few among the patrons recorded as they cowered in fear. And when I saw the expression on my face, I realized why I could go so easily being labeled a hateful monster. It was pure rage. My features were distorted beyond recognition. It was not a face I saw in the mirror, but red, flushed, bestial features, contorted in mindless fury, teeth showing, eyes bulging, nostrils flaring, and hair bristling in every direction. My chest was heaving, and all muscles in view were tensed and flexed with veins popped. I was a monster. The two robbers got their own labels, among which were victims, alleged perpetrators. Did I mention that there were several videos? Promising futures, treasured members of their families and community. The one I had put through the glass cover had a severed jugular and had exsanguinated all over the fresh veggies. Bjorn paused in his narrative and gave a feral grin. I guess it was no longer a vegan-friendly tree. The media claimed that I was unarmed, never mind that I'd knocked the arm from him. The other, of course, had died when he pressed the trigger of his pistol, when the bullet gave him an instant and overdue frontal lobotomy. So, in the public eye, I was transformed into a troubled, hateful youth. When they got a hold of my confidential juvie and school records, I was socially convicted by good citizenry. I could not go anywhere while the story played. And sadly, I prayed for something bigger and more awful to happen to shift attention away from me. And it eventually did, as it always does in this world of woes. I was legally cleared on the criminal side, but it was a low point in my life. Even the armed services, they wouldn't take me. My folks almost lost their home in civil suits, but the restaurant had deeper pockets, and so the focus shifted away from us. I managed to start college, but had another episode on the football field. I was trying to learn discipline on my own, but the plan, it backfired. I was kicked out of school, fired from my job, and once more social media painted me as a monster. Even my folks were fed up and ready to send me packing. And then I got a text from someone named Ed. With that, he grinned more naturally at his audience. I know it wasn't Uncle Jim Tail, but perhaps it will lend some perspective. As I said, I worked very hard on when and how my episodes occur. Just don't get me angry. He paused the way Uncle Jim liked to do, and waggled his eyebrows in a similar manner. The rest dutifully chorused. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. The youngsters asked Blue Jay about his time working at the nearby college. When I got out of the service, I decided to work in law enforcement, but jobs were tight that year, so after I was licensed, I took the first available position. And I craved adventure and advancement, so I had applications at several big departments. When the hogs changed my world, then Ed came along and completely upended it with the offer of the Cobalt program. So, what's the J stand for? Cassie asked innocently. And Silvio gently admonished. We do not ask about each other's working names. Some we choose ourselves and others are thrust upon us. Some are simply given names or surnames, the way we initially introduce ourselves. We do not ask for explanation, though an associate may offer their full name or explain their handle, strictly on their initiative. Cassie started to apologize, but Blue Jay interrupted her with a laugh, his first since he'd returned to the area of his traumatic assault. You know how the blue was added. He raised his arm and leg in turn. Everyone called me Jay, because that's what I call myself. He looked around a little sheepishly. I go by Jay because my first name is actually John Quandris. I grew up in the burbs, but my dad was straight up hood and my mom was a wannabe in her youth. Unfortunately, dear old dad dashed mom's dreams of hood life and abandoned us. Sylvia and McCall smiled, and Bjorn muttered, Bit of a mouthful, and Jay is easier to spell. And Jay snorted. When the folks split the sheets, Mum brought me here, to H-Town, and we stayed with my grandparents. He flicked his chin towards the sickly yellowish glow in the southern sky. The army was my way to get college money. Had some adventures, but nothing like Big Bjorn. Nobody ever heard of me. Now, enough story time. Let's get some rest. Black Cat Ridge was swarming with two-legged mill offerings. Some had come to the area the night before. They had two unusually large dog creatures with them. He had eaten dogs and coyotes but favoured herbivores and omnivores for taste. These two were larger than any he'd encountered, but still no match for his bulk. The two legs had all been alert and carried what his mother had warned him were weapons. Small things, but deadly, even to his kind. He decided to avoid them and hunt other meat. Now there were many more of the creatures, and they infiltrated his territory with impunity from many directions. He would have to find a place to lay low and plan. He could not cross the river, at least not where he had previously. He thought that it may be time to wander into the deep swamp and then try to get back to the edges of where the two legs dwelt in large numbers. He enjoyed the bins of food they left outside their dens and the occasional pet that wandered into range of his jaws. The slightly grainy sound of radio communication filtered through to TAC Team Adam. Only the team leader would acknowledge since it was from another team leader. Adam 1, this is Boy 1. We have reached the apex and planted. Once you and Charles have completed your sweeps, come up the eastern side. We'll rendezvous, regroup and go back down each side. If there are any other targets loose in the area... The message ended abruptly. The team alerted and listened as gunfire erupted on the ridge. It was distant, but the sharp reports of large caliber firearms barked into the night, followed by faint screams and squeals, and then trailed off to silence. Boy 1, this is Adam 1. Status. Came through the primary channel. Adam, Charles, stand down. It was ferals. Normal ferals. I say again, normal ferals. Big and plenty of them, but normal. Looks like our monsters were just a larger hungry sounders and some typical Black Cat Ridge activity. Mystery solved. Great. We have the hounds and we have the eye in the sky, but the place is for the local law dogs. We'll remain on standby until or unless they leave. We should have better luck in the early morning for this hunt anyway. Jay briefed the team. In the meantime, we can practice some maneuvers and ensure that we are a well-oiled machine when the time comes. Now they'd relocated to Crazy Coon Hill, just northwest of Black Cat Ridge, through over a mile of swamp and heavy vegetation. There was a housing development closer to them than the ridge, but they did not intend to conduct live fire exercises. It would not have mattered. The company had issued them the latest sound suppressors for their individual firearms, and part of their drills was to practice silent signals and low-volume radio communication. After a few hours, they took a break to check the satellite images and rest. And there were some sniggers from the Cryptid cat crew when they watched a replay of the tactical team ripping through a sounder of feral pigs. Stern looks from the experienced field associates ended the mirth. That team conducted an effective operation. They may have taken out our target before we even get to look at the part of the feed. They were naturally wound up and nervous. Assert what they do well and where they fail. Then we will discuss how we will do better. Silvio, already in the habit of field training new associates, offered. After watching and discussing, the team settled in to wait. The sheriff's office team was wrapping up and would move out soon. Then it would be their turn to set up and wait or beat the brush as they had the previous night. As they settled in to rest for a while, the conversation turned to less important matters, and each argued his or her way to pronounce San Jacinto. And the youngsters explained the significance of the name as applied to the eponymous battle that won the Texas Revolution in 1836. Will cleared his throat. Speaking of pronunciations, Uncle Jim would tell us stories to ease our minds and get us in the right mood. I remember one he told us about the pronunciation. It might settle our discussion. With that, he assumed a raspy, old man's voice. I was on the flight from LA and sat next to a nice-looking lady. We got talking and she said that she'd been visiting friends in San Jose, only she pronounced it Sans Jose. I wanted to be polite but save her future embarrassment, and so I told her that in California they pronounce it like in Spanish. The J is H, and say it San Jose. I asked her when she was there. She thought for a moment and said, in Hune and Hulai. There were smiles and chuckles all round. Bjorn noted, you do that voice a little too well. How about you, TJ? Can you do it? TJ gave a rare grin and cleared his throat. As he opened his mouth, Bran and Skylan rose, hackles up, and growled fiercely into the dark of the night. McCall took his place between them, weapon at the ready. The others rose and strung themselves out into a loose line. Will and Cassie assumed rear and flank guard. A chittering laugh rang out from the darkness to their front. The team caught a glimpse of fur-covered figures as it turned and waddled back into the swamplands between Crazy Coon Hill and Black Cat Ridge. Silvio grinned and turned to face Blue Jay. That's one of those the brain warned us to ignore. Not of this world. A grunting roar overwhelmed the last of his words, and a tremendous bulk burst from the wall of vegetation and thundering hooves. Several of the team fired into it or past it, since the range was short and the beast was so fast. It twisted its ugly head and skewered Silvio. The man was lean and fast, but the scowl was not in his favour. The tusk reached him and pierced his side. It ripped through and left him to sprawl back onto his haunches. The saber-toothed hog swung its head in the other direction and attempted to turn towards Blue Jay. However, TJ slammed a 12-gauge rifle slug into the bony lump on its forehead. It left a bloody dent and clearly stunned the creature, whose momentum carried it into the side of the RV. The side of the camper crumpled under the mass and momentum and the monstrous porker. It struggled to regain its feet and continued to fight despite the disorientating wound. Cassie and Will each turned towards the fleshy freight train and placed a few rifle rounds into the body. And Blue Jay stepped forward and fired at its left foreleg and kept firing until the appendage was useless. Yet, even with severe wounds, its vitality allowed it to struggle free and spin around to ward off its attackers. Bran and Skylan danced around and looked for openings, and McCall danced with them. He had firearms, but at the moment carried a spear with a pierced head and a spike at the butt end. The hog eventually stopped its spinning and shot back into the brush. It hobbled with a ruined front leg, but still managed to move at a ferocious speed. McCall whistled up to the hounds and they gave chase, the rest of the team falling in behind him. Bjorn called out, "Take care, there may be more." And the team members, other than McCall and the hounds, slowed and assumed a protective formation as they advanced, down towards the San Jacinto. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. Absolutely wonderful, chest-pounding stuff, and an excellent swamp story there. Such great character development there, Michael. Always awesome reading through your stories. and really do appreciate all that you do for the show. Guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. Of course, if you're an aspiring writer, want to get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforesterfear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. A big happy new year to each and every one of you. I hope you all had a lovely time with friends or family and made the most of things in this strange and challenging times. Above all, guys, we're back in gear. Looking forward to dumping lots of content over the next few days. I hope you're all well and happy, your friends and family alike. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.